could this thing last but the age of miracles hadn't passed, for suddenly I saw you there, and through foggy London town the sun was shining everywhere.
There is a certain romantic element to it. Walking down to the embankment from St Bartholomew's, for instance, with gas lamps and a swirl of fog, listen to Vaughan Williams' London Symphony. The slow movement captures it completely.
We grew up with fogs. We used to go down to Portobello Road and nick the fruit and nick anything that we can get hold of, but nobody would chase us because of the fog. They wouldn't run after us.
I can remember fogs being every winter, but they don't sort of actually strike a note with me. But because my dad died that weekend, I can remember the weekend very clearly.
Any fog would cause an increase in deaths, but this was sudden. You see, in most cases, those people would have been taken into hospital. But this came like a killer in the night, literally.
In December 1952, the world's romance with London's fog ended in a disaster, the true extent of which has never been acknowledged. Now, hidden documents reveal how one of the world's worst peacetime catastrophes claimed as many as 12,000 lives in the centre of London. The Christmas shopping season had just begun when the fog descended on the city.
I don't think the bleating devil himself could have driven it away. It was that thick. On that night, it was vicious.
It was a warm fog. It was wrapped around you. It was all-possessing.
It was smelly, it was dirty, it was black.
It had an acrid, acidy feel about it.
It seeped into the houses, and indoors everywhere's covered with a sort of grey film. It's quite uncanny.
Round about 3 o'clock, it started getting more dense. And towards the 4 o'clock period, our crane driver said that he couldn't see. His visibility was down to nil. And we couldn't see him, but he said he could see the clouds. He could see above him, but he couldn't see through. So there was a mantle of thick fog between the ground, and he was somewhat 50 foot above us. And in consequence, we stopped work.
The Great Fog not only did its best to keep shipping tied up, it made things very unpleasant for everybody.
At Sadler's Wells, the performance of La Traviata was stopped when the audience could no longer see the stage.
The fog had came down while we were in the cinema, and you couldn't see the screen. It was, I mean, you could see that it was light, but you couldn't make out the details on the screen, so you simply went home. And you were talking about here an enclosed building, but that's what it would do. It would come into, God only knows how it did, but it did. It came in.
At the Smithfield Livestock Show, stockmen tried using whiskey-soaked Hessian masks to protect the cattle from the fog.
Well, it was a green colour, and it hung around in these caves down below. It never got clear. There was no way it could get clear. Every beast has to lie down just as you and I do, and they just never got up.
traffic in London was completely at a standstill on many occasions. In fact, the fog was the worst on record for many a year.
The street lights you couldn't see, and it was really blacker than any blackout we had during the war, because there was bugger all you could see.
It was one of the first times, I think, when I realised that although I was partially sighted, my other senses were far more acute than anybody else's. My mother always came to meet me from school. She was talking to me, trying to make it seem as natural as possible so that I wouldn't get worried and afraid. And I suddenly told her to stop, and if I hadn't done, she'd have hit her nose on the wall, because she just hadn't realised the wall was so close. She was inches from it. But I'd heard her voice change with the sound echoing back from the wall, which was obviously even thicker than the smog.
My younger brother was on a funeral which started out at West Hendon, and by coincidence there was another funeral in the same road that same afternoon, and in the smog the two funerals got completely mixed up, and there was just a convoy with two lots of funeral vehicles, a milk float, a dust cart, and that wasn't very popular.
Fog, the longest and thickest on record, brings Britain its darkest days since the blackout. It gives transport services an even bigger headache than bank holiday.
I was walking in front of a vehicle going into Eastbourne Memorial Hospital, and got in there, pulled round to the casualty and walked round the back of the ambulance, and behind me was a baker's van. And he put his head out the window and said, "Well, where are we, mate?" You know, I said, "We're at Eastbourne Memorial." He said, "Oh, I thought you knew where you was going." So I said, "Well, I do, but you're the one that's lost."
Once here, the fog comes to stay.
Slowing down traffic of all kinds, cutting down visibility to a dangerous degree, putting a premium on how to get to work, and more important still, some may think, on how to get home.
Driven in many fogs, but that one was outstanding, 1952, because fog and smut just used to stick to the window. It was like sticking there like paint. You just couldn't see through it. So you had to, if you was going to try and make a journey, you had to either lean out through the side window on your left, if you could get out that way, or look out through the door on this side.
When the buses came to Stamford Hill, they all stopped and they didn't move any further because of the fog. My father was stuck there. My young brother went down to look for him, walked down to the hill. We lived about another bus stop up the road here in Elmers Park. And he found my father on the bus and half carried him home.
My father was actually at work at Camberwell, and he walked home that night. So, and it was the following morning that he couldn't breathe.
In Britain, weather always makes news. If it isn't a blizzard, it's fog. Perhaps it means a good summer to follow. Perhaps. Meanwhile, the beastly stuff gets right into you. Can't see. Can't breathe.
Oh, people were going sick all over the place. They were just falling down and just couldn't breathe.
And you could see my father was very ill. My brother was cradling him in his arms, you know, he couldn't get his breath. You could see it was really bad. The doctor said it when he came in the next day. He's weakening, his heart is weakening.
Of course, by then the fog was really, really thick, and it was coming in all through the windows. This was a problem, and into the room.
A Movietone cameraman drove through fog-shrouded London to report on the traffic chaos. The great smog invasion has caused a major dislocation of rail services. It's a menace, this choking, eye-watering smog.
During the night, I heard Mum banging on next door's wall and screaming out. And there was no ambulances, so you couldn't get ambulances out. The only way that they could get ambulances was if somebody walked in front of them with a flare.
One ambulance making its way across the city was carrying a young army doctor and his patient, a 21-year-old sailor who had collapsed in the fog.
I've never seen anything like it in a person of that age, a young man on active service in a state of complete collapse with breathing difficulties and obviously with a desperately failing heart. I tried the two local hospitals, but unfortunately they were overwhelmed with civilian cases, chest problems which had flared up because of fog, and they could hardly cope. So it had to be Millbank. And when we got there with a great sense of elation, we'd made it against all the odds, and I rushed out the back to find that he had just died as we arrived. Just at that moment breathed his last. I tried to resuscitate him, but that was pointless. And the drivers were in tears, and I personally felt a great sense of defeat.
He died on a Tuesday evening, he was buried Wednesday morning. We were very, very upset with when he died, naturally. He was such a lovely man, you know.
Tolerant, understanding. He's just a lovely person.
He was.
My dad was 42 when he died. I can remember him quite well, really well, in fact. He had a very distinctive knock at the door, and I can remember that very well. And for a long time afterwards, I used to listen for the knock at the door. He was a lovely man, actually, really lovely man.
In the aftermath, questions began to be asked. Why had this particular fog taken so many lives? Why had London been so unprepared? The minister in charge of the government's response was Harold Macmillan.
Macmillan was very offhand in the Commons. If you read his replies, well, yeah, members can't blame my colleague for the weather, and this kind of remark. And there was no acceptance that this was a man-made disaster which needed remedial action.
I am not satisfied that further general legislation is necessary at present. We do what we can. But the honourable gentleman must realise the enormous numbers of broad economic considerations that have to be taken into account.
As he joined his family for Christmas in 1952, Harold Macmillan was still blaming the weather.
The culprit is the November sun. Having already shed its summer load, it fails to provide sufficient heat to dispel warm currents of air arriving from the Gulf Stream. Britain was back in the Dark Ages.
It was in the Dark Ages that London's air first began to turn bad. The Industrial Revolution turned London into the most powerful city in the world. Its furnaces fueled an empire.
The interests of the few are opposed to the interests of the many. 100 gentlemen connected with these different furnaces wish to make 2 million of their fellow citizens swallow their smoke.
In 1873, 700 Londoners died in a single week of fog. In 1880, 2,000 were killed.
Such are the results, more fatal than the slaughter in many a great battle, of a want of carefulness in preventing smoke in our domestic fires.
By the turn of the century, the city was shrouded for 90 days of every year, and London became intrinsically linked with its bizarre and multicoloured fogs.
In the year of 1895, a dense yellow fog settled down upon London. From the Monday to the Thursday, I doubt whether it was ever possible from our window in Baker Street to see the loom of the houses opposite.
Conan Doyle's descriptions are of droplets that were yellow and oily. T.S. Eliot talks about it like a yellow cat, you know, curling itself around buildings. So we have very, very sort of keen and accurate descriptions of the kind of yellowness in the fog of London at this time.
The great painter Claude Monet came to London specially to paint the colours of London fog in the winter. And he thought that the combination of colors, brown, he listed them, brown, orange, yellow, grey, black, was wonderful. And changing as the sunlight came through them and so on. I mean, he was fascinated with the changing light that these pollution particles caused.
Just look at the dominance of the factory chimney right along the back of the river. I'm sure that when Monet finally arrived in London and saw something like this was exactly what he wanted. The sense in which the fog sort of simplifies the whole scene and makes it almost an abstract painting. Impressionist painters throughout the late 19th century had their canvases dominated by factory chimneys in the background, and this creates a sort of impression of what kind of society it is.
In the 20th century, it was a society where up to a third of all children in Britain's cities suffered from fog-related diseases.
My chimney is adding to the pall which hides the children of London from the ultraviolet radiation of the sun. If they don't get enough sunlight, they will develop rickets. Now these children here are getting artificial ultraviolet radiation in order to protect them from rickets.
We used to call it sunlight treatment. You'd sit around in a circle and you'd have these dark glasses or goggles on, and this light would be flashing all the time. It was quite a novelty, really. You thought, when you went to school next day, you made up hair-raising stories about actually what happened to you, but nothing really happened. You just sat there staring at the light.
We can't always guarantee him sunshine, but there's plenty we could do about this. Two proverbs occur to me when I look at a modern industrial city. Where the sun enters, the doctor doesn't. And the funeral coach comes twice as often to the shady side of the street. We'll spend thousands on a building, dirty it, then wash it, till it stands out, as someone said, like a bride at a funeral.
Window cleaning is a dirt trade. Soot clings to windows. It sticks to people's faces. Some beauty specialists regard the cosmetics industry as mainly another dirt trade. To a great extent, laundering is another dirt trade. And if the housewife complains, she knows that her own chimneys are partly to blame.
Every year, approximately 75,000 tons of soot falls on London.
Now I have here the amount of smoke in the air breathed by an average Londoner in a year. Terrible sight. Well, what can be done about it? Well, most of this comes from the domestic fire, and it is those of us who like to sit around the smoky fire that are responsible for this very great difference. So it's up to the lounge customer to do something about it. Exactly.
I love the old open fire. If you're a bit lonely, you're sitting by yourself, it's like having a companion. Just like you'll talk sometimes to your cat, you can sit and talk to the fire. You're talking to something that is actually living. That is why I love a fire.
Here is the main source of atmospheric pollution, producing more smoke per ton than any other appliance in use. Worse than industry.
Londoners' love of an open fire was officially blamed for most of the city's pollution. But there was another culprit. Government maps show how the worst pollution clouds radiated in fallout zones around the city's power plants during the 1952 disaster. 25 years earlier, the government encouraged the building of these power plants in the centre of London.
Not far from the Thames embankment, a giant skeleton of steel is going up.
3 huge stations were built at Southwark, Battersea and Kingston. The last of their smokestacks was fired up just 4 years before the 1952 fog.
It gives me much pleasure to declare the Kingston Power Station open.
Royalty, however, had at first played a secret role in a wide opposition movement to the central London power stations.
Dear Mr. Chamberlain, the King is sorry to trouble you when you must be so very busy. His Majesty feels the greatest concern at the erection of an enormous generating station at Battersea, and London being polluted by large quantities of noxious fumes.
Battersea was the first real environmental battle of the modern age.
This will kill every green thing within 2 miles of Battersea, rot all the buildings, and bleach all the babies.
The battle was lost because local government insisted a new device would remove the smoke menace. But when the device was installed, it only made matters worse.
Sometimes it would just simply like overflow with smoke. It would come out, pour out, and just simply tumble down to the ground. Obviously on other days it would go straight up. But basically that was the big problem. It just covered the area. It was like a fountain, for want of a better term, I suppose. And it just would gush out all over the place.
I want to take this opportunity to congratulate all who have been responsible of the fine example British enterprise, skill, and weapons.
In 1930 there came a warning from Belgium. Yellow fog choked 74 people to death in the Meuse Valley. An official inquiry compared the effects to poison gas warfare and warned that smoke from Battersea could lead to lethal fogs.
The public services might be faced with the responsibility of 3,200 sudden deaths if such a phenomenon occurred in London.
But most British politicians were not sympathetic to reducing London's smoke.
Although I may be told that the smoke from my coal fire assists in poisoning the people outside, I prefer that very much to being poisoned myself by a gas fire in my own home.
If the government needed any more warning, it came in 1948 from a small town 7,000 miles away. In Donora, Pennsylvania, industrial smoke and polluted fogs had killed off the vegetation, so that when it rained, the graveyard was washed away and the dead came out of the ground.
Bits of bodies would wash out when, after a bad storm, they would come floating down on the road. When the rain got bad and washed down, why, it would take parts of them with it.
But the real horror came in the winter of 1948. The people of Donora will never forget it.
So, I guess everybody here has heard of the smog, right?
It was yellow and thick. You put your hand out, and your hand got that far and you didn't see it. I mean, you saw your arm, but there was no hand. That's how thick it was.
At first, people didn't think much of it because it was just like any other day. You know, days around here were always smoky.
During the day, we took it as a normal reaction in regards to this fog business because we've had it several times.
It was an ugly, yellowy, saffron-colored stuff that made your eyes burn and water.
As the days went on, people started to die.
We had 3 undertakers at that time who were managing to help the people down to the community center, down in the basement, is where they had these cots set up, and they just placed them there. They wouldn't be dead at that time and right away, but they had no possibility of ever helping them. They just had to let them lie there and pass away.
So this event opened the government's eyes, and they saw that they needed to regulate air pollution.
The deaths in Donora in 1948 were the focus of an international conference on air pollution in 1950. Britain's representatives reported back to the government the conference's recommendations. Smoke control in local areas.
By establishing smokeless zones. They mark off an area, and within that area, every known remedy is strictly applied. In homes, offices, industry, the installation of any apparatus emitting smoke is strictly prohibited. And what's more, it can be made to work.
Local councils demanded the successful measures be implemented in Britain. 6 months before the disaster, Housing Minister Harold Macmillan refused their demands. Churchill's government had its own agenda, and burning coal was central to it. In 1952, Cabinet was trying to conceal the fact that the country was bankrupt. In the autumn, it was revealed the nation was £500 million in debt. The government moved to pay off its debt with one of the country's remaining assets, stocks from the newly nationalised coal industry. The highest quality coals were being exported overseas. The resulting fuel shortage meant that low-grade smoky coal was being burnt on London's home fires. Pollution warnings were ignored as the government encouraged the country to burn more coal.
And the government give us your coal. I'll still find there's room in cellars for more, so why not stop now?
Many householders, because of storage space, are unable to stock all they want. But here's one housewife who has done so.
As a housewife, I have laid in all the coal I'm allowed this summer, and with coal the price it is now, we are going to make the best use we can of it with one of these new all-night fires.
An all-night fire. If they were used in every house, then the experts say we'd go a long way towards beating the fuel shortage.
To cover against the emergencies which a hard winter could present, every advantage has been taken of the summer months to build up our coal stocks.
In spite of the weather for most of the holiday, people went to the Battersea Fun Fair in vast numbers. Some took their pleasure sedately on the boating lake. They were twirled about in tubs. They careered, shrieking, up and down the Dipper. And not content with that, they were flung around in whirling jet planes, spinning, revolving, upside down, inside out. In fact, they fairly revelled in one glorious, sickening sensation after another. All the fun of the fair and a bit more thrown in for luck.
As usual with the approach of winter, doctors warned Londoners with chest complaints to leave the city.
The people with asthma and bronchitis are the ones who give us the trouble. The fog makes it difficult to help them. When I was in Manchester, the death roll during foggy weather was nearly twice as high as during a normal winter period. Here's your prescription. Now, mind you take it. Righto, Doctor.
One of those told to flee the capital was 20-year-old Queenie Bilton, who had recently recovered from pneumonia.
The hospital then said that it was imperative that she got out of London because, you know, with the smog and that, there would be no chance of her surviving.
As Battersea Fun Fair closed at the end of the 1952 season, the temperature in London began to fall.
The weather at that time was usually colder in the winter, and in the Thames Valley, it flowed down the sides of the valley, the cold air, when the ground got cold at night. The cold air converged on the Thames.
Towards the end of November, weather stations began to track a mass of warm air moving from the Gulf Stream towards the city.
Well, you know, we're unlikely to get through any winter without a cold spell, but it just isn't possible to give a forecast for the coming one.
I was a professional meteorologist in the university at that time, so I always kept an eye on the weather system. And I thought, well, this is going to be a bad pea super. And if it stayed for more than a day or two, there would be a great accumulation of smoke.
On Friday, December the 5th, the mass of warm air came to a standstill, creating a lid directly over the city. In the colder streets below, a light mist became thick with coal smoke trapped in the stagnant air.
The next morning we had a call from Sir Bentley Purchase, the St Pancras coroner, saying, this is a crisis. Our staff are completely overwhelmed and I just want some people non-stop.
You only have so many undertakers. You can't suddenly say, OK, we've got this inrush of dead bodies, let's incorporate a few extra undertakers. I mean, undertakers are undertakers, that's all they do. So if you've got this rush of dead bodies, then the whole thing, you get like a logjam.
Well, it happened to be myself and two of our men, and we spent the next 3 days just going round the back streets. Sometimes the police would be called to break in, sometimes neighbours had got a key, or friends or relatives became worried. But in nearly every case, there's an old person in bed who died gasping for breath, because there's nothing like it, nothing like the smog before or since.
Police found the body of Augustus Curtis in a Bellingham street. When they broke into his house, they found his daughter-in-law about to die in her bed. Undertakers removed 10 bodies from one address in Marylebone.
And we were just shuttling backwards and forwards to the coroner's mortuary. It was an absolute nightmare. I wouldn't like to go through it again. I don't know how many, 50 maybe. I shall never forget it.
Because there were so many people died, you couldn't get the plots dug and bookings, and I suppose people nowadays wouldn't realise that, but you just, there was just nowhere to bury them.
50 victims were brought to Lewisham Mortuary over the weekend.
And when we got to the mortuary, it was unbelievable. It looked like something out of an old-time horror film. And the assistant mortuary keeper said, you should have come last week, he said, because we had them standing around the wall, he said. There was masses of them.
When all the numbers are added up, there were about 4,000 excess deaths, and the mortality remained elevated for about another 3 weeks. And if you took the whole period, the excess mortality was about 4,000.
4,000 has remained the official total of the dead. But the government's first report, issued 11 months after the disaster, show the death toll as 12,000. The figures revealed the government had overseen a public health disaster as deadly as any Victorian plague. 4 months later, a committee appointed by the health minister subtracted 8,000 deaths from the total by declaring a cut-off point of December the 20th. They said anyone who died after that date was not a victim of the fog.
The day he died was the 30th, so he would have been buried on the next day. The Wednesday would have been the next day, would have been January the 1st. I would think he would have lived on if that fog hadn't have happened. I'm certain of that. I mean, it lasted 4 days. It never ceased, did it?
And not only that, but he'd been working up to then.
And we were averaging at that time about 60-odd funerals a month. We're talking about December 1952, 108, January 104, Feb 102, March 80. 80 funerals, 80 people, 80 families. Some of them were very bitter, naturally. Naturally, without the smog, Mum would have still been alive.
The ministry said a flu epidemic and not the fog had killed the 8,000. Yet official World Health Organization records show that the flu claimed only 457 of the 8,000 who died in the aftermath.
These old people, they'd been through 2 wars. They deserve better than that.
The United States pledged 100,000 free gas masks to protect Londoners from the next fog. But there was a catch. The masks would advertise a new filter for American cigarettes.
The smoke draws free and easy, cause the filter's micronite.
The government rejected the offer.
Damn silly.
Secret tests by gas warfare experts had revealed masks were no match for the fog.
No known mask will protect them from it. Every fog this year, according to the press, will be a killer smog.
Reports now calculated more than 6 million Britons were at risk. Macmillan had to do something.
Ridiculous as it appears, I suggest we form a committee. We cannot do very much, but we can be seen to be very busy. And that's half the battle nowadays. There are some short-term things which we can do. We can gain popularity by them, the masks, etc.
Special filtering bunny masks are the latest weapons devised to combat smog, which last winter killed 4,000 Londoners in a single week. Dogs as well can be protected against the deadly fumes which throw a heavy pall across Britain's big cities every year. Ordinary fog does little harm, but smog has become one of the greatest mass murderers of modern times.
They started giving us a tuppenny halfpenny bit of bleating cotton to put round your nostrils and round your mouth. And when we challenged them, we took them to the North Middlesex industrial section, the hospital, and they said they're useless. They're useless.
Harold Macmillan ignored the expert advice and pushed for masks he knew to have no effect. The National Health Service was ordered to divert funds towards the distribution of 3 million masks. London's next big fog revealed the results. By the time London suffered the last of its great fogs in 1961, government measures had failed to save 100,000 lives. The fog of 1952 had killed 10 of Dr. David Bates's patients. But how had they died?
When one of our patients died, we tried very hard to get an autopsy. I don't remember attending one. And then about a week later, we heard about the cattle.
Despite all attempts to save them with whiskey-soaked masks, at the Smithfield show, 13 animals have died of what the stockman called fog fever.
I well remember going to the Royal Veterinary College and examining the lung sections to see what had killed these animals, and it was a very acute inflammation in the small airways of the lung.
In its windpipe, it was all green, sort of horrible sludgy stuff all round about, and you maybe could get just a modern little one of these big pens through the centre, and that was all the air that was left for them to breathe.
And we guessed that this was what had killed our patients too, was the same thing. And not a bacterial thing, and not anything that an antibiotic would have made any difference to, but an inflammation in response to the fog that they've been breathing.
In America, research into the 1952 disaster has come to a surprising conclusion. London is not a foggy town at all.
Well, I usually ask the students in my class if they remember these Sherlock Holmes movies or movies about Jack the Ripper, where there's this swirling fog going through these alleyways in the East End. And they all remember that there was a killer lurking in that fog swirling around in the street. That swirling stuff in all those nice period movies wasn't fog. What they had in London was air pollution.
This air pollution begins with natural fog, which forms when water condenses into mist in the cold air. In London, these mists became mixed with the hot smoke from chimneys, mutating into dense man-made fogs. Like water poured on hot coals, cold, moist air billowed over the hot chimney stacks, creating more fog, which sank to the ground, trapping the city.
There were 3 great air pollution disasters in the 20th century, and all of them occurred when there was a low-level temperature inversion that locked all of the pollution into a valley where people lived and where there was a great deal of coal combustion generating air pollution that then got squeezed into a small place and the levels skyrocketed.
The 1952 disaster forced the authorities to recognize the culprit not as a trick of the weather, but as a man-made killer. The mix of smoke and fog, smog, was pursued with new laws.
I think after the London fog, the government of England introduced the Clean Air Act to get rid of the open burning of coal and to clean up the air in London. Unfortunately, at the same time, traffic has increased a great deal, and an awful lot of the traffic in London is diesel buses, diesel taxis, diesel cars.
At that time, we did a calculation of what the effect was of different kinds of pollution source. And one of them was houses, and then there were big chimneys and small chimneys and trains. And trains and road traffic were recognized as the next on the list. The houses were the worst, the traffic, which was obviously going to increase enormously.
You look at those buses going down the street, and the smoke that's coming out of the back is black. It's not green.
It was one day, not long ago, London had to say goodbye to her last tram. Sometime, someday, it had to come. And some people were glad to see the back of them. And some of us were sorry they were going.
The change from trams and trolley buses over to diesel buses in the 1950s was, from the public health and environment point of view, a disaster. And has had a huge impact on the health of Londoners.
In the name of Londoners and London transport, I say, goodbye, old tram.
The last electric tram was replaced by diesel buses on July the 5th, 1952. At the time of the disaster, 8,000 new buses were being driven into London's fog.
I never forgot it. Those people didn't die in vain, because it was part of the process of starting, getting rid of open coal burning, understanding how to heat a city without this problem. And so I think historically an important marker, and therefore I think quite apart from remembering people who died, it's very well worth reminding ourselves that it was the catastrophe that marked a turning point.
Despite their smokeless home in Lambeth, Mrs. Mitchie and her family are still threatened by smog, which can travel hundreds of miles. Flats like theirs are the first step towards its banishment. Though little Paul Mitchie sets Father Christmas a new problem. Through the door, please, he says, not the chimney. We haven't got one.
Okay. All right.
Having followed doctors' advice to leave the city and so escape the 1952 disaster, John Bilton and his wife Queenie now believed government action had made it safe to retire back home to London.